organized and good morning, everyone. So today we are continuing in the book of Devarim. We are in the book of Deuteronomy, and we are at the Torah portion of Parshat Re'eh. So as we mentioned multiple times, the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, is different than the first four books of the Torah in that the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, is notably spoken in the voice of Moses, meaning that, excuse me, there's some people still coming in here. It's spoken in the voice of Moses, meaning that while the first four books of the Torah are a series of God's instruction or recording God's direction to the world or to the Jewish people, the book of Devarim is really the words of Moses to the Jewish people. On the last leg of his life, the sages say the last 37 days of his life, or the last 2 months of his life, where he is getting ready to leave the Jewish people, and he has a whole generation of young people who were born in the desert, who were not present at the giving of the Torah, who were not present at the Egyptian exodus, and who are now going to go into the land of Israel. And Moses wants desperately that these young people and this new generation is aware and cognizant of the heritage of the Jewish people and the traditions and the laws. And he wants to underscore very strongly to them that the success of the Jewish people and their mission and their stay in the land of Israel will be inevitably tied to their connection to the Torah and mitzvot. And he does warn them that ultimately they probably will rebel and they'll be expelled from the land of Israel, but that ultimately they will come back and that they will be forgiven and renewed, as it were. So what we have in the book of Devarim, as we mentioned last week and the week before, is we have a series of teachings, a certain amount of review of the Torah, and a certain amount of almost pleading that Moses is making to the Jewish people. And we can feel through the words of the text, we can feel the emotion that Moses is expressing and almost his sense of desperation that the Jewish people should hearken and listen to him and understand that what he's telling them is so tied up to their destiny. And so the book of Dvarim is a series of a blend of these reviews and these promises and pleadings. So we will have a mix of different teachings that are found in the Torah. And we're going to just review very briefly the overview of the Torah portion. At the same time that we are reading Devarim, and this week's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Re'eh, we are also in the last leg of the Jewish calendar. Most notably, after Tisha B'Av, after the 9th day of Av, we turn towards the beginning of the new year. Last week was Tu B'Av. It was the holiday that the Jewish people celebrate as a matchmaking holiday. But most importantly, also, we said that this is the day that marks 6 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, there is a shift towards looking into the present and looking more to the future, to the new year. So the last 6 weeks of the year is focused on getting ready for the new year. As well, and something that we mentioned as well, is that after Tisha B'Av, after we commemorate the destruction of the temple, there is a series of haftorot that are read on Shabbat that are called the haftarot of comfort, of tanchumin. And usually the haftorah is connected to the Torah portion somehow, because the haftorah at one point was there to replace the Torah reading when the Torah reading was prohibited. But in the last 7 weeks, starting from Tisha B'Av, the haftorah is going to be connected only to words of comfort and future redemption. So it's not connected to the Torah portion at all, but rather It is a series of readings from the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, that talk about future redemption and God comforting the Jewish people after a tragic and long galut. And so as we get further and further away from the destruction of the temples, the haftarot of comfort become more and more meaningful because we are going towards the future comfort and the future redemption. So inevitably, the book of Devarim is also tied to this kind of retrospective look at the Jewish people in the desert and also looking forward into going into the land of Israel, albeit sadly without Moses. So there is a certain synergy between the haftarot that we are reading now and the book of Devarim, which is again Moses looking forward to the future and telling the Jewish people the tools that they will need to be successful in the land of Israel. So this week's Torah portion is called the Torah portion of Re'eh. The Torah portion of Re'eh is the fourth Torah portion in the book of Devarim. So we have Devarim, Be'ezchanan, Ekev, and now Re'eh. And the word Re'eh literally means to behold or to see. It has the same etymology as Re'iyah, to see, to witness. And what Moses is telling the Jewish people in the opening words of this Torah portion is, Re'eh, behold, see what is in front of you. You are going to have choices to make. And it's interesting that we see that throughout the book of Devarim, there are two languages that are used when Moses wants to exhort the Jewish people or press an idea on them. And one of them is the idea of Shema. And we have this throughout the book of Devarim, where Moses says to the Jewish people, Shema, or Shema Yisrael, and so on. And not just the prayer of Shema, but just the language of Shema here. And now we also have the word Re'eh. And those are both used throughout the book of Devarim, both Shema and Re'eh. Shema, of course, means to listen or to hear, and Re'eh means to see. And think about it, when we recite the Shema, when we do recite the Shema, the words that actually talk about the idea of listening, what do we do when we recite the Shema? We cover our eyes, right? We cover our eyes when we recite the Shema. So when we talk about Shema, it is an exercise to pay attention to that which is not so obvious, almost like that which requires more faith. You have to close your eyes and physically divest yourself from what you see and lean into something that you have to feel or hear, which is much more abstract and much more difficult to attain. But when you say Re'eh, see, it's very simple. It's a terminology that is used to describe something that is apparent and right in front of you. And even in English, we have that idea when a person says, do you see what I'm saying? It is a form of talking and a form of speech where we're trying to conjure the idea of something that is very patently obvious and not so obscure and not so esoteric. So the language that Moses is going to use to the Jewish people is going to be indicative and important for us to understand what message he's trying to give the Jewish people. So the name of the Torah portion is a Torah portion of Re'eh, which means to see. And of course, as we mentioned many times, whenever the name of the Torah portion is called by that name, there's a certain leitmotif, a certain synergy with that concept that is there throughout the Torah portion. So today, I want to explore the opening verses of this Torah portion. But before we do, I do want to go and just do a brief overview on the Torah portion so we have a snapshot of what the Torah portion talks about. And then we're going to go back to the opening verses and we're going to explore the verbiage and the rabbi's commentary on the verbiage of this idea of behold, look, see, pay attention to what I'm telling you, and again, using the language of sight. So let's get into just a very basic general overview of the Torah portion, and then we're going to get into the opening verses of the Torah portion. So when Moses starts talking to the Jewish people, he essentially tells them, I am placing before you a blessing and a curse, and the blessing will be if they fulfill the commandments, and the curse is going to be if they abandon them. And this refers to the fact that when the Jewish people cross over into the land of Israel, they're going to engage in a certain liturgy or a certain, I guess, event where they're going to be separated into two groups, and half of Israel will be placed on one mountain, a mountain that is very verdant and bountiful, and the other half will be placed on another mountain, which is kind of barren. And the Levites will be in the center of the two mountains. They will be in the valley, and they will be saying all the blessings that happen to the Jewish people should they follow the Torah, and then the curses. And those on the verdant mountain, Mount Gerizim, will say Amen for the blessings, and those on Mount Evel, the barren mountain, will say Amen. So this is something that's going to take place later. When the Jewish people cross into the land of Israel, there will be this event that they will have. It's almost like a renewal of the vows that they will have before they really enter the land of Israel and start inhabiting the land of Israel. There will be this kind of commemoration that they will have to go through. Then the Torah talks about the fact that when the Jewish people come into the land of Israel, ultimately they will be called upon to worship in a Beit HaMikdash, and that is going to be the place that they should gather, and not to bring sacrifices just anywhere, wherever they may find themselves. And the reason for that is because in Canaan, so in the Middle East of the day, everyone in their backyard essentially had an altar, and they would bring sacrifices. And there would be a confusion about who the sacrifices would be brought to. Were they sacrificing to God? Were they perhaps sacrificing to the local deities of the day? And so therefore, the law was, no, you have to come to Jerusalem. You have to go to the place that I will show you, says Moses, and there you will bring your sacrifices to ensure that people are not starting to worship the local deities. And that is an overarching concept that we find in general in the book of Devarim, and also in this week's Torah portion, where Moses is very concerned somehow that the Jewish people, once they go into the land of Israel, will be drawn into some type of idol worship, the worship of the deities of the day. And therefore, there is a tremendous amount of warning against it. And so Moses says to the Jewish people that they can sacrifice there in the Beit HaMikdash, in the place that God chooses for the Jewish people. And Moses says that if you want to eat meat, you may eat meat at home, but not in a sacrificial fashion. So there is a permission for the Jewish people to eat meat. That is very explicit in this week's Torah portion. But right alongside that comes the prohibition of consuming any blood. And that's very underscored. And then the Torah talks about the fact that there's going to be false prophets that may come and encourage the Jewish people to worship idols. And then we have Moses reviewing with the Jewish people the identifying signs for kosher animals and fish, and also a list of the non-kosher birds. And these are, of course, were already taught to us in Vayikra, in Leviticus, but they're repeated here. As I mentioned, part and parcel of the purpose of Devarim is a repetition of the laws. Then we have the laws regarding the tithing, meaning that 10% of the produce that the Jewish people have has to be given to Jerusalem or eaten in Jerusalem or given to the poor. There were different types of tithings. And then following that, the Jewish people are taught the idea of giving tzedakah, giving loans, and that loan should be forgiven at the sabbatical year. And then finally, the Torah portion of this week concludes with the holidays, the instructions for the holidays of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So that's just the Torah portion in a brief nutshell. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Torah portion itself. We're going to go to the opening words of this Torah portion. And these opening words, of course, are going to reflect the name of the Torah portion And we're going to explore some of the ideas that our rabbis have shared on these opening words. So let me share my screen with you as we open the Torah portion of Re'eh. So here we are. This is the Torah portion of Re'eh. And as I mentioned, it begins with the words, Re'eh anochi nosein lefnechem hayom bracha uklala. Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. And of course, the challenge whenever we have the translation that is presented here, and I think the translation that Chabad.org uses, which is what we're using right now, is from the Hirsch Chumash, I believe. But again, the challenge is that it's not a precise translation. It's trying to give you the meaning in the context. So it says, behold. But Re'eh literally means to see. As those of you who are familiar with Hebrew, Lirot means to see. Reish Aleph is to see. So there is a sense of, I want you to see something. And it opens up with the words, I'm giving you a blessing and a curse. And Rashi explains, Re'eh anochi, what is this that Moses is referring to? And he says, Ha'amurit bahar grisim ubahar evel. These are the blessing and curses that will ultimately be said on Mount Gerizim and Mount Abel. As I mentioned before, Mount Gerizim and Mount Abel are two mountains in the land of Israel, where the Jewish people will have some type of ceremony on these mountains, which will review certain of the laws and say those who will fulfill them will be blessed, and those who violate them will be cursed. And then Moses continues, "Es habracha asher tishma'u." The bracha, the blessing is if you will listen al mitzvahs Hashem, to the mitzvahs of Hashem, Elokechem, who is your God, asher anochi mitzavcha eschem hayom, that I am commanding you today. So he says, what's the blessing? The blessing is to listen to the mitzvot, and as Rashi says, "Ve'es habracha," the blessing will come to almanos asher tishma'u, that you will obey. V'haklala, and the curse, im lo tishmu al mitzvahs Hashem, will come to you if you do not listen to the commandments of Hashem. V'sarta min haderach, and you will leave the path. Asher anochi mitzavcha eschem hayom, that I command you today. And what do you do instead? Lalechet l'charei elikim acherim, to follow other gods, asher lo yadatem, that you did not know. In other words, you go to foreign concepts, go to foreign ideas. And Rashi says here, min haderach asher anochi mitzavcha hayom lalechas. What is this idea of veering off the path? Rashi says, ha lamadata. This is to teach us, kol ha'ayved avodah zara, that anyone who worships idols, arei husar mikol haderach shenitzdavu Yisrael, they ultimately are just leaving the path altogether from the Jewish people. Mikan, from here, says Rashi, and he quotes the Sifri, Mikan, from here we learn, from here we understand, and from here we study. Amru, that our sages say, Hamayra b'avodah zara, someone who is, Hamayda b'avodah zara, someone who acknowledges foreign idol worship, Kikaifer b'chol haTorah kula, is as if they deny the entire Torah. And so when we open up the Torah portion and they're given this instruction of blessing and curse, what Moses is saying to them in the very plain meaning of the verse, as Rashi elucidates it, is that this: if you follow in the Torah's ways, you'll be blessed. If you don't follow in the Torah's ways, you'll be cursed. And what is the ultimate veering off of the path of Torah? This is the worship of idols. Now, if you look at the book of Devarim, and if you look indeed inside the entire Torah, there's a very big emphasis and underscoring against the worship of foreign idols, foreign worship. And it's almost like this is one of the greatest challenges that faced the Jewish people at the time. And if we study the Tanakh, if we study the prophets, if we study the kings, the history of the Jewish people that follows after the 5 books of Moses, we do see that this challenge ends up being one of the greatest threats facing the integrity of the Jewish people, that somehow they keep getting drawn into this idol worship. And this is what they are warned about over and over again. Now, to our Western minds, the idea that people would be so drawn to worship foreign gods seems to be an anathema. It seems to be so strange. Why would you worship a tree? Why would you worship a stone? Why would you worship stars? It seems to be so out of our frame of reference that we wonder that how is it that this was something that drew the people in? I mean, the Jewish people were so much more sophisticated. They believed that the creator himself, the force of creation, could not be encapsulated in a tree and could not be found just in a rock or in a star or in the cosmos, that there was something vastly greater than anything that was physical that moved the universe, and that it was above and beyond anything we can understand, that there was a force of creation that was found in everything that was beyond our ability to even comprehend, so much more sophisticated than the people of the time that just worshipped whatever they could lay their hands on and say, oh, this is my God. And the question that it must be posed when a person is studying Torah and they see Moses pleading with the Jewish people, please do not worship these idols, is what was drawing the Jewish people? Why was there such a need to remind the Jewish people, don't worship idols, don't worship idols, don't worship idols? The Jewish people were so much above and beyond that. How is it that this was something that drew them in so much, that we do see that first Moses is warning them against it, but later on, if you look at Tanakh, that over and over again, the Jewish people do fall and start worshiping the local deities. So that Moses' concern is not unfounded. It's not that Moses is worried about something. He understands that there's a great pull. So the rabbis in the Talmud discuss this, because even at the time of the Talmud, it was not clear how idol worship could be such a draw, and that it could be such a problem in spirituality for the Jewish people. So the rabbis in the Talmud discuss this idea of idol worship. Why were the Jews so drawn to idol worship at the time? And the rabbis say that we cannot understand it because it was so much part of the culture of the time, of the zeitgeist, and therefore our point of reference is so different from it that we can understand it, but they do say that if we would be living in that time, rest assured we will be struggling alongside everyone else. In other words, it's not there's something with us that's somehow superior to the Jews of that time or to the Israelites of that time, but rather it was so much part of the zeitgeist. And I remember struggling with that. Well, that just doesn't make sense. I would never want to worship a tree. It just doesn't. You heard God. You heard God yourself on Mount Sinai. Don't have any other gods before me. How do you veer off and have this problem that Moses has to exhort the Jewish people and call the choice of worshiping God, the choice of life, and the choice of not worshiping God, death, the choice of worshiping God, blessing, not worshiping God, curses? Why do they have to be reminded over and over again not to worship? And with time, I think one of the things that come to my mind in a way that I think that we can understand it, it's a very light way of understanding this, is this, that if you look at any generation, so this is something that I always found very fascinating. If you look at any generation or any decade, today it's in decades, that there's a certain fashion sense that emerges, that becomes very trendy. And what happens invariably is that there's a fashion sense that takes hold and everyone gets caught up in that fashion. And then a decade or two later, usually two, so let's say the kids of that generation, so the next generation, looks towards the previous generation's taste and fashion. They go, what were you thinking? I have this with the 80s, like your hair was crazy in the 80s. Everyone had perms and puffy hair. And I remember I had a perm. Why would I get a perm? So nonsensical. And I look at the times like puffy curly hair, but it was something that you had to have because everyone did it. And even if you were a nice Jewish girl, it was still you're still influenced by it. And then sometimes what happens is that the uh it falls out of fashion, and you look at these people who are dressed a certain way, and you go, that was so crazy. And then the next generation after that will go back to the fashion. So let's say now the 70s fashion is kind of in a bit, but with a slight variation. So the 70s doesn't seem so odd anymore, but the 80s seems odd. And it's a funny thing that we get so into that we look and we say, like, what was anyone thinking? Or the music of the time. There's a certain music. And all of us, I guess, they say this, that if you grow up at a certain time, the music that was popular in your teenage years and your 20s is the music that you will find the most beautiful always. You see this at weddings when they play certain genres of music. There are certain people who get up and go, oh yes, this is my song, and it just speaks to them. So you see people really get into it and they feel good in that space, and then they can appreciate other generations of music, but it doesn't have the same nostalgia and the same warm feeling. And it's like that's when people say, well, that's when music was real. Now it's just noise, or the time before that it was boring. But my generation, and usually it's the teenage years and the early 20s, that they say that you will always find that music just the most soothing, the most beautiful, the most hip, whatever you want to call it, the most romantic. You will always be drawn to the music of that time because there's something that happens when your brain is forming and you're becoming an independent person and you're not choosing the music of your parents, that you always will have this kind of sense of attachment. So if this is true on things like clothing and music, and people get really crazy about those things, we can understand that if there is a culture, there's a zeitgeist, if there's a way of understanding the world that everyone is really into, it's very, very hard to go against it. And you see this even within the Jewish community. Let's say there's certain precepts and principles that become part and parcel of the Jewish community, of the larger Jewish community. And if you question it, you're like, what are you saying? You're like, you're just completely out of whack, even if that which the Jewish community is following is not necessarily part of the Jewish tradition. But there are certain things when we become part and parcel of a culture, it's very, very difficult to engage differently and to disengage from it. And so Moses understands this very well. As he's telling the Jewish people, if you go into the land of Israel, there's going to be a culture there. It's going to be intriguing to you, but you should know that this culture is going to disconnect you from something that is so much more powerful. And the eternity of the Jewish people, indeed, is tied up with not fitting into the culture, but holding on to something that's much higher and much deeper. And I see this today. I see today that there are certain ideas that are so culturally acceptable, and I know that it's not part of the Torah tradition, and therefore it's very, very difficult to hold on to these ideas. When Jews came to America in the 1930s, 20s, in that era, and the American Jews wanted very badly just to be American or fit in, or Canada in the same vein, but not to that same extent. The Canadian Jews were always a bit more conservative. The idea that you would not work on Shabbat, the time when the American spirit was that you work hard, follow the American dream, don't be lazy. The idea that you would take off Shabbat for an ancient ritual of Shabbat, it was an anathema. It was ridiculous. And those who kept Shabbat, who came from Europe in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, found themselves jobless every Friday. And mostly their employers were other Jews who said, not in America. America is different. You cannot do this Shabbat in America. This doesn't fly here. It doesn't go here. So the idea of having a higher ideal and living by that higher ideal is sometimes very confusing, because if everyone is doing something, and the power of the common culture is so persuasive that it actually is very difficult to swim against the tide. And so we see with Moses that the exhortations that he is pleading with the Jewish people, please be careful. I'm going to frame this in very stark terms, says Moses. I'm going to tell you, this is a blessing for you, and this is a curse for you. Be very, very, very cognizant of this. This is what he says in this week's Torah portion. Towards the end of Devarim, he puts it in starker terms. He says, this is a blessing for you, and this is life. And then he says, and not following the Torah tradition will be a curse for you, and it will be death. He's using such stark terms that we can say to Moses, okay, are you not exaggerating a little bit? Well, maybe it's a good idea to follow the Torah. Are you telling me that it's a blessing and it's life? And if I don't follow it, it's death? So maybe it's not immediate death, but it is ultimate death, because it is going to disengage you from your precious Torah and your precious ideas and your precious culture. And so the challenge of a Jew has always been to swim against the tide, to be different. And at the same time, Jewish people don't want to be that different, because we want to be accepted. If we are a Jew living outside of Israel, we want to be accepted as a good citizen in our society. And indeed, the Talmud says we have an obligation to be good citizens in our society, so much so that the Talmud tells us, Dina de Machusa Dina, that the law of the land becomes the law of the Torah, unless it's violating the spirit of the Torah. So that we do have this need and the desire to be a good citizen. Or if we are the nation of Israel, we want to be accepted in the family of nations. It's an innate pull. I want to be recognized. I want to be part of you. We know that isolation and being left out socially is one of the most traumatic experiences that people can experience if they're children in a school. For example, bullying. What's bullying? Bullying is ostracization. You're being separated from the rest of everyone. And it's a very painful experience to go through. So the innate human nature would be to be drawn to say, I want to be like everyone else. And so therefore Moses has to place it in the starkest of terms to say, this is life and this is death. This is a blessing and this is a curse. And it's not hyperbole. Ultimately, this will lead to our blessing. Because if we become the nations of the world, who will be the Jewish people? And more importantly, who will be connected to the mission of the Jewish people, which is to be God's nation and a light unto the nations of the world. And of course, to give into the zeitgeist, especially when that zeitgeist is lacking the morality of the Torah, is very problematic. So you see that Moses is giving us this exercise. And then the question of idol worship. What is idol worship today? So I heard something so beautiful. I heard from Rabbi Manis Friedman, and I saw also wonderful teachings on the subject of idol worship from Adin Steinsaltz. But I want to share with you something that Manis Friedman says about idol worship. And he says, anything that you are going to give assign power to that does not deserve that type of adoration is an idol and will disappoint you. Anything that you value above God, above anything else, if you put too much value, if that value is on a currency, if it's on status, if it's on people, it will ultimately disappoint you. Idols disappoint. And I saw something also very beautiful from Rabbi Steinsaltz, where he talks about the idols of today. And he says the idols of today are not the idols of yesteryear, where there was stone that people worshipped, or trees, which was very, very common in the Middle East, the Asherah tree, where people worshipped in front of this tree and gave gifts to the tree in the hope that the tree would somehow do some magic for them. He says any of these ideas of, for example, youth. He says youth is an idol. The idea of staying young forever. It's an idol that ultimately, when you worship this idol, you will find that you will be worshipped for having the strength of this idol. And then one day, When you no longer qualify, you will be discarded. Like idols that are no longer working for anyone are discarded. So he talked about youth, about power, beauty, fame, fortune. All of these, he says, ultimately will turn on you. There's a song by a band called Eighth Day. They're a Hasidic duo, two brothers, and they have these modern tunes, but the ideas are very deep. And one of the songs I remember hearing from them is a song about fame and how fame can be a double-edged sword. And one of the verses in the stanza goes as follows: it goes, "They put you up on stages, and then they'll put you into cages. They'll tell you you're their brother, and then they'll sell you for another." And I think it's such it's a truism that we do see this, and we see people falling from grace, and people who were worshipped all of a sudden are hated. And what happens? The media or whoever turns together with everyone and says, no, this is no longer our God. This is not someone we worship. And it could be ideas, it could be people. And this is what Moses is warning the Jewish people. In every generation, there's going to be the idols. In the time of the Middle East, the idols were, yes, trees and stones and maybe the constellations. But anything that you put above the Creator himself is an idol. Any power you give to anything, and that could be even politics and even the political process or politicians, anything, or even a country, even putting your country above the ethics of God will end up being a problem. You cannot put anything above God. So let's get into the text now about this idea of blessing and curse, because what we find very interestingly is this, that when these words are explained or translated, we will find a divergence of these. And I found there's a teaching from the Rebbe that kind of analyzes this, and I wanted to share that with you because I thought it was enlightening and thought-provoking. So the verse starts up with the words, "See, I have given in front of you a blessing and a curse." Now, as we mentioned, every chumash that we have today has in it the Rashi. Any chumash that's published by a Jewish publication company will have Rashi. There is no chumash without Rashi. Rashi is almost the translator of the Torah. As well, every chumash that we have today, most commonly, will have in the margin of the Torah, of the chumash, it will have in the margin something called Targum Onkelos, which means the translation by Onkelos. And the translation by Onkelos, as we mentioned in the past, is a translation in Aramaic. If you look at a Torah page, this is of course online, so it doesn't show us this. But if you look at a page of Torah, you will find that you'll have the text of the Chumash, and then on the side will be this translation. And the reason for this is simply because as Jews were more and more assimilated in the diaspora, and even in the land of Israel, when they were disconnected from the original language, they were no longer able to study the Torah without a translation. So Onkelos was one of the great translators of the Torah, and today every Torah has in it the commentary of Rashi on the bottom, every Torah scroll, every Chumash, and the commentary of Onkelos in the margin. Now, as we mentioned before, Onkelos was the nephew of the Roman emperor who converted to Judaism and became a great Torah scholar. And so his translation of the Torah is in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the time. It was the way people spoke even in the land of Israel. And so what I would like to do today is I'd like to make a contrast with two commentators that the Rebbe brings out to explain a deeper idea. So even though I don't have a Chumash in front of me, I don't have a regular page of Chumash, I do have the commentators' online, and so we will go into that online. So we have the first verse here. Renei anochi nesein lachem bracha klala. Looks like I stopped the share by accident. Renei anochi nesein lachem bracha klala. I'm giving you a blessing and a curse. So now we have the Targum. We have the Targum Onkelos. So I'm going to go to Sefaria that has the Targum Onkelos, and it starts off with the following words. And we see here that this is Onkelos, the commentary on Onkelos, and this comes to us from the Mitzuda Chumash, and this is the Torah portion of Re'eh. It's the opening words, and we see the translation is, "Look, I place before you a blessing and a curse," and we have the words of Onkelos. What does Onkelos say? What's the translation? Chazeh. Chazeh means to see. Chazeh means a vision in Aramaic. Chazeh di ana yahev, that I am placing. Ana is I. Yahev, placing. Kadmechem, kadmechan, before you. Yom adin, birchan. I'm giving you a choice of birchan. Now you see the etymology is very similar to bracha, blessing. I give before you a blessing, ulevatin, or a curse. So Onkelos says that this is the translation, blessing and a curse. Another Targum, another translation that is found on the Torah, comes to us from one of the great rabbis, one of the great Tanaim. And his name is Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel. Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel was one of the great and holy Tanaim rabbis who lived. He was one of the students of Hillel the Elder, and he was a tremendous Torah scholar and also a mystic. And Rabbi Yonatan Uziel, his translation is also called Targum. Targum means to translate. His translation is different than Onkelos. Onkelos, the translation of Onkelos is literally like you would find a translation in a Chumash. He literally was translating the words for the average person in the language of the time, which was Aramaic. And yes, being that he was a very wise Talmid Chacham, within his translation, we do kind of understand certain precepts because he will elaborate on those and bring those out. Yonatan ben Uziel was a great mystic. And it is said about Yonatan ben Uziel that when he studied Torah, he studied with such fervor that literally everything around him got so heated that if a bird flew over him, it would burn. I don't know if that's a euphemism, but it meant that there was a certain energy around him that was very intense. And that he started a translation as well, a Targum, but with a mystical inclination in the translation. And at one point, he wanted to translate the entire Torah and the Tanakh. When it got to the part of the Tanakh that talks about the prophecies of redemption, he no longer was allowed to give his interpretation. He felt that God didn't want him to publicize this, and he didn't. But his dream was always that the Jewish people should see that time of redemption so that we should get to the core of the matter. Essentially, that's what redemption is. Redemption is getting above and beyond the obvious and going into the deeper idea of that's found beneath the surface. So Yonatan Uziel was a mystic. And by the way, parenthetically, we mentioned this before, he's buried in the northern part of Israel near Tzfat, I think a 15-minute drive from Tzfat, in a valley. And the valley is called Amukah, which just means valley in Aramaic. It's a very, very steep valley. And even today, in modern Israel, it's a little treacherous to get down there because it's a very, very steep valley. And there's when you're driving down those roads, you have to drive very carefully and slowly. And he is buried in this valley, and people go to his gravesite and they pray there. Specifically, people will pray for shidduchim, to have good matches for their children or for themselves, because Rabbi Yonatan Uziel saw that everyone, I don't know his status, Yonatan ben Uziel, I'm not sure of his status. I would be surprised if he was single, because in the rabbinic tradition, all Torah scholars are really enjoined to have a wife, because a person is seen to be a half a person if they don't have a wife. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure about his status. But suffice to say that he was a very mystical person, and he wanted very much that there would be complete revelation on the mystical part of the Torah. So he also has a translation. And the translation that he has is slightly different. It's also in Aramaic, but slightly different than Onkelos. So I want to contrast his translation with the translation of Onkelos that is found in the Chumash. So let's go to Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, the Targum Rabbi Yonatan. And here. Where am I here? Oh, I just I lost it. 1 second. Here. Okay, so here it is. Where am I? Share this. Yes, people get engaged after visits. So that, there's definitely I think he did say, if I'm not, I don't know if this is legend, but I think he did say that if those people who will come to his gravesite and pray there, that their prayers for shidduchim specifically will be answered, because he saw the more marriages and the more children that are brought into this world, the closer we will get to redemption. So let's get to this. This is as here we have the Targum Yonatan on Devarim. Devarim. Let me just move this down so I can see the screen. So the Targum Yonatan on Devarim, and he has this word Re'eh Anochi. Behold, I set before you. And this is the words of Rabbi Yonatan. Amar Moshe Neviah, Moses the prophet said, Chamain da'ana. Behold, on this day, Mesader kadmechan, I put before you. Ana Mesader kamechan, Ana is I. Put before you, Yoimai Dain, on this day, Dain birchata, the idea of a blessing, Viki Lufa. And it's contrary. So you see here that also a teaching in Aramaic that posits that God puts before the Jewish people a blessing, and yet in the language of Targum Yonatan, what does he say? Dein birchata v'hi lufa. It's blessing, and if you could recognize the etymology of bracha here, the blessing, chilufa means, here it's translated as it's contrary, but chalef in Hebrew means to switch. Chiluf is to switch. So in Aramaic, that would be the same. So basically, Onkelos says that a blessing and a curse, he translates bracha and klala, blessing and a curse. And here he translates the blessing as blessing, but he does not translate the word klala, which means curse, as curse. Rather, what he does is he translates the word klala as hilusa, which means it's opposite, or it's flip side. And so opposite and flip side does not mean the same. Okay, so Fiona asked the question, if men and women are both considered a half a person until marriage? No, a man is considered a half a person, not a woman. A man is considered a half a person, because for a man to fulfill his destiny, he has to have a wife. That's what the rabbis say. A man is considered half a person. The mitzvah of marriage, by the way, parenthetically speaking, is on the man and not on the woman. A woman, of course, does a mitzvah if she gets married, but she doesn't have the commandment to get married. A man has the commandment to get married. It's interesting because you need a woman to marry in order to get married, but the rabbis have not put that responsibility on the woman to get married, maybe because the rabbis knew that all women had dreamed one day of being a bride and not necessarily men dream about these things. I don't know, but the rabbis mandated that it's a mitzvah for a man to get married. It does not put that onus on a woman. Just that's not the way it's taught. So back to this idea of the language of Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, the Rebbe denotes that even though the translation here, and I said this is one of the tricks with translations and books, it's because often in these works, the attempt to translate is to give a context to what's being taught. But in Hebrew, the exact verbiage or the exact etymology of the word actually sheds light on a deeper teaching. So we have to translate carefully. So when Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel does not call a curse, but rather says a curse is the flip side, because chilufa means to flip around or to exchange. So he says it's a blessing and the flip side of a blessing. He does not say a blessing and a curse. And so the Rebbe asks the question, why is it that Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel does not translate the word curse as curse, but rather he translates it as flip side? And the Rebbe says that Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, being that he was a mystic, and he was in the tradition of the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. Yes, I have been to Amuka several times. I've driven down to Amuka myself. That's why I say that the drive is treacherous. I actually rented a car and drove there. So I know what it means to drive down to Amuka very carefully. So, especially in Israel, some of the drivers there are wild. So Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel is translating it as flip side. So the Rebbe says, what's the idea of a flip side? He says that Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel was a mystic, and he saw a deeper dimension to the Torah. And he sought to teach the deeper dimension to the Torah. That's why he had this wish to translate even this, almost like the secrets of the world to come. And he was stopped because, as if he received a message, the world is not ready for it. And this is why he wants to give blessings to those who want to get married, because he sees it as the emerging of the ultimate redemption. So Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, if you would say, he studies Torah through a redemptive lens. A redemptive lens is not what is now. It's not living in the present of what is now, but in the possibilities of what could be in the future in a good way. Whereas Onkelos was just explaining the plain meaning of the verse. And the Rebbe says, why is it that we see this difference between Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel and Onkelos, who are both translating in Aramaic? And the Rebbe said, perhaps it's because ultimately Onkelos came from Rome, and Rome represents the outside of the land of Israel. So more practical, but less to its core truth. Whereas Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel was from Israel, and was from the sages that are mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud, and he is one of the great Tanaim, and so therefore he is connected to a part of Jewish tradition that has a more mystical and I would say redemptive approach to studying Torah. And indeed, that's what Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel wanted most of anything else, was to see ultimate revelation and ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, clear and good for all mankind. So not just in the here and now, but in the potential of the future. So Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel is studying through a redemptive lens. And so therefore, Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel says he doesn't call anything a curse. He sees everything as a potential blessing. So he says, Vichi Lufa, and it's flip side. Basically, what he's telling us is that a blessing and a curse is really one thing. Just it's the two sides of a coin, and all the difference is only in manifestation, but that the essence of it is one and the same. So that ultimately, everything that comes from God is blessing. There is no curse in the Torah. There is no curse at all. The Torah is all blessing, and it's only a question of finding the blessing. And so that in this verbiage of chilufa and its flip side, Rabbi Yonatan ben Uzziel is teaching us a very cosmic teaching, which is that everything that comes from divinity, everything that comes from God, is ultimately a blessing. It's just the flip side of the coin, so that the essence is the same, the manifestation is different, and it's only a matter of time where the ultimate manifestation is going to be positive. And that's why we're told that when the redemption will come and everything will be clear, we will say to God, Otcha Hashem ki anaftabi, thank you, God, for having persecuted us, for having made it difficult for us, because we will see the blessing in the difficulty. And we will not see the difficulty separated from the blessing. So ultimately, what Rabbi Yonatan ben Uzziel is teaching us is that everything that comes from God is a blessing. And it's not a cute use of words. It's reflecting a very deep concept that is found in the Kabbalah, that there are multiple manifestations of this universe. And in the highest form, everything is just light. In the highest form, everything is pure and everything is good and everything is goodness. But the manifestation on this earth is different. And therefore, what is our choice? Our choice is to make the so-called flip side and flip it around. We can flip it around, essentially. If it's something different, if it's a completely negative thing, what are you going to do with some complete negativity? There's nothing you could do with complete negativity. But if it's only the flip side, our responsibility and our task then is just to flip it around and to find the good and to search for the good. And this is a very beautiful teaching that I find in today's day and age is very hopeful. The idea that ultimately everything is for the good, and we will see the good, and our job is to flip it and find the good. Essentially, it's two sides of one coin. That's the teaching of Rabbi Yonatan ben Uzziel. And I want to share with you in this closing words a teaching that I heard from my father last night. I went to visit my parents up in the country, and I told my father, Tati, tomorrow I'm giving a Torah class, and do you have a nice insight that I could share with the ladies that I study with? And my father shared with me this beautiful teaching, and I wanted to pass it along to you. And my father said as follows. We know, my father's a Hasidic rabbi, so very much living with the idea that everything, even the so-called curse, is a blessing. It's only a flip side of something. So we know that everything that comes from God is good. So then why does the Torah speak in such stark terms? Why does Moses put in front of the Jewish people such stark terms? Re'eh, behold, I see, I give you a blessing and a curse. So my father said to me as follows. He said that sometimes we are so lost, and this again harkens to what I said at the beginning of the class, which is the idea of the cultural norms and the zeitgeist of our day that could be so confusing and obfuscated that we see sometimes even in Jewish leadership a lack of clarity. We see it in Jewish community life, things that are wrong, so that we become confused. We don't even know sometimes what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. What is essentially the blessing and what is the curse? We don't know. Ultimately, every curse is the potential blessing. But when you don't know the difference between a blessing and a curse, that's very confusing. But if you know the difference between what is a blessing and what is a curse, that is the blessing. So that's why it says, my father told us to me last night, that's why it says, Re'eh, see. Because if you can see, and you could see clearly, not like you're not confused, because seeing, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, is an expression of clarity. Whereas hearing, Shema, is a suspension of self to believe in something higher. I'm going to hear something. Seeing something for what it is, having clarity. So to the point that we could say, I see it. I can see this. You can point it and say, this is what I see. When you have that type of clarity, and therefore you know the difference between a blessing and a curse, That is the blessing. So what Moses was positing in front of the Jewish people was, I'm going to give you a blessing. And what's the greatest blessing I can give you, says Moses? I want to give you the blessing of clarity, that you should see and you should know the difference between what is a blessing and what is a curse. And we know that there are times in our life, so certainly, let's say in a child's development, in teenage years, would be a time where they have a very big difficulty to make a distinction to know what is the blessing and what is the curse. Often they choose that which is shiny, and that is not the blessing. And you could tell them, but they don't understand. So in our life as well, we also have, I guess, this challenge in we have our teenage moments where we are in a situation and we don't know what is the blessing and what is the curse. We're confused, whether that is a moral confusion, so as a people, as a nation, whether that is a personal confusion in a choice that we have to make. And certainly we see this societally now. There's a lot of confusion. And that which seems to be blessings are really curses and vice versa. What Moses is giving the Jewish people is ultimately the blessing, the ultimate blessing. So the entire verse is not a choice between a blessing and a curse. The ultimate verse is that God is giving us a blessing. What's the blessing? The greatest blessing that we can be given, Moses tells us, the greatest blessing is re'eh. It's the clarity of knowing the difference between a blessing and a curse. Because when you know the difference between the blessing and the curse, and you know the difference, you know that this is a blessing and this is not a blessing, then you can make the choice with a full heart and with clarity and with courage and whatever else that is needed. And so what Moses was telling the Jewish people is the greatest blessing of all is the clarity to know the distinction between a blessing and a curse. And even though it's true, that sometimes that which seems to be a blessing is really a curse, Moses lays out to the Jewish people what is a blessing and what is a curse, and that's being connected to the eternal Jewish values. But inherent in Moses' words is also a message that the greatest blessing I give to you is to have that clarity. And that's something I think that we could really appreciate. I think it spoke to me very strongly, because I think we live in a world where there's so much obfuscation, there's so much confusion, and people don't know the difference between a blessing and a curse. And then, of course, on a personal level, the greatest concern that we could have, the greatest lack of joy that we can feel is when we have the confusion and we don't know, is this a good thing or this is not a good thing? And to have that clarity, to know this is a blessing, even if it's difficult, this is a blessing and this will lead you to blessing. Having that clarity is the greatest blessing of all. And that's what Moses was giving the Jewish people, the blessing to have clarity. So I want to pass on the blessing to all of us. May we have the blessing to have clarity in our personal lives, to do that which is right within our families, and also even, let's say, sometimes it's career-wise, sometimes it's in marriage, in finding a marriage partner, in choosing a career, in making choices, and certainly for the Jewish people, that the leadership of the Jewish people should have the clarity to know what is blessing and what is the opposite of blessing. And ultimately to know that everything that comes from God, as Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel teaches us, is good. It is only the flip side of the other side of the coin. And our job is to flip it around and to see the blessing and to find the blessing and to have the clarity to know what is the blessing. So I wanted to share that with you. I want to wish everyone a week of blessing. And as I mentioned at the onset of my class, the Haftorah is replete with blessings of hope for a better tomorrow. God, as it were, in this week's Haftorah talks about paving Jerusalem with beautiful stones. And of course, those stones reflect the idea of just clarity. A gemstone, the more clear a gemstone is, the clarity. And one of the four A, B, C, D of a diamond, right, is C. It's the clarity. So the most precious thing is to have clarity. And may we all have clarity in our own lives. May our leaders have clarity. May the Jewish people have clarity. May the world have clarity. This is the greatest blessing that we can all hope for in a time of the opposite of clarity. But as Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel says, Even the opposite of clarity is not a curse, but only a flip side of something. And our job is to flip it around. So I wish everyone a Shavua Tov, a blessed week, and a week of seeing and clarity. That's the greatest blessing that we can all have in our lives.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yes, and I want to add one more thing, that mystically speaking, transparency is always connected to the divine. Obfuscation, darkness, cloudiness is the lack of the divinity. So yes, a positive light. And let's be clear for others as well. Let's be a positive light. Thank you everyone for joining me, and I wish everyone a blessed week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.